I'm going to call this meeting of the Gloucester School Committee to order. I'll remind everybody that the mission of Gloucester Public Schools is for all students to be successful, engaged, lifelong learners. And this meeting is recorded by video and audio in accordance with the state open meeting law, consistent with the governor's orders suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law and banning gatherings of more than 10 people. This meeting will be conducted by remote participation. If you're calling in on a phone, you can press *9 to request to speak. If you're watching on a computer or device, there is a raise hand button that you can tap or press to request to speak. Please use either of these options during oral communications to be recognized to speak. Thank you. Maria, we need to take a roll call so that it goes on the record who is here. And the mayor is in transit, and she called in just before the meeting and said she is here, but she's not going to be able to respond. So
Okay.
we can mark her present.
Okay. Okay, so Chairman Pope,
Here.
Ms. Prince,
Yes, here.
Ms. Watson. Can't hear you. Sam,
Yeah, you're mute. Yeah.
She looks like she's frozen up, so it might be an internet issue. And Magnolia, we don't have the best.
okay.
Hear me?
Yep.
Yes, here.
Ms. Weason,
Here.
Kathy Clancy,
Here.
and I think that's it.
Well, you got to call Joel and register
right.
that he's not here.
Mr. Favazza is not here.
Right. Okay. He is given. He's in another meeting, and he will join us as soon as he can. Okay. Oral communications. If there's anybody here who would like to speak to the school committee, this is an opportunity to address any issue that's not on the agenda. And I'll repeat this again. If you're calling in by phone, you have to press *9. And if you are on a device or a computer, there should be a raise your hand icon on your screens somewhere. Okay, seeing none, we will move back to our regular agenda. This is our fourth interview. We will conclude our initial round of interviews tomorrow evening at 4 o'clock. And we will then convene after the meeting to discuss how we're going to proceed and with who and how. Kathy?
Can I make a suggestion that we book a meeting for the school committee for Tuesday, knowing we need to get down to a certain number for finalists, and if we don't have something on the calendar, I don't want to assume that Friday, tomorrow, we're going to get to that place, but I also don't want it to be Wednesday, Thursday, because because of the holiday, we're going to run into things that really push us out farther.
Right.
I think it's too late to book for Tuesday.
No, it's not.
Yeah,
48 hours, business hours. Monday's a holiday.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyway.
We'd have to do it right now for 10 minutes from now on Tuesday.
Maybe Wednesday.
We have a meeting scheduled for Wednesday, a regular meeting. We can add it to the agenda if there needs to be follow-up. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Tonight we have Kurt, and I'm guessing at this Laxo.
Yeah, Laxo, yep.
Okay.
Should I send the text?
Yeah, send the text. Are we ready? Everybody's aware of the change in the order of questions, and if Joel doesn't show up, I will read Joel's question, and I am going to read the mayor's question. So there we go. Bring them in.
Jonathan, can I just say that I didn't print off the questions, so when it's I assume I have the same questions, but when it's my
Oh, yeah.
turn, you just tell me it's my turn?
I will. I've been doing that. Yes, I will tell you.
And tell me if it's the collective bargaining one or the school committee, the first
They're
one or
in
the
the
second
same-
one?
Sorry, they're in the same order. So you'll ask the one that you asked first.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Laxo.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm well. Welcome to Gloucester, and we are happy to have you here to interview for the position of Superintendent of Schools.
Well, thank you for having me.
We have 5 finalists, which
Mhm.
I'm sure you know,
Mhm.
and you are this is the 4th interview. We will be having one more interview tomorrow, and after that, we are going to try to narrow the field down.
Okay.
Okay. So we'll start by introducing ourselves. My name's Jonathan Pope. I'm the chairman of the school committee. Melissa?
Hi, welcome. My name is Melissa Texera-Prince. I'm vice chair of the school committee. Nice to meet you.
You as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Laura?
Hi, I'm Laura Wiesen. I'm the secretary of the school committee, and welcome virtually to Gloucester.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Laura.
Kathy?
Hi, I'm Kathy Clancy. I'm the chair of the Building and Finance Subcommittee. Nice to meet you.
You as well, Kathy. Thank you.
Samantha?
Hello, welcome. My name is Samantha Watson.
Okay.
Meet you.
Nice to meet you, Samantha.
Maya Safafia Taken sits on the school committee, but she's in transit right now. So she's
Okay.
listening in, but she's not able to respond. So she's here with her ears to hear everything that goes on, but we don't get the pleasure of her thoughts.
Well, nice to meet your ears, Mayor. Thank you for having me.
And also there's another member, Joel Favaza, who is has had a conflict tonight. He's in another meeting that started at 5 o'clock. He hopes to join us soon, but he
Great.
hasn't yet. So that being said, let's start with you just giving us a little background of yourself and a little indication of why you might want to come to Gloucester, and then we'll have about 12 questions, and then we'll have a little wrap up. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Pope. I really appreciate this opportunity. I am from the areas. I believe you've learned that I'm from Newburyport, Massachusetts, which is, of course, the other end of Cape Ann there. And so I've long admired Gloucester. I've enjoyed visiting many times, and I've certainly been a fan of the city. I actually have several friends I've played hockey with throughout the years from Gloucester, and I think that probably is what originally connected me to the city. But I know it's a tremendously, close-knit community. I know that it's an extremely proud community, and the school district is a fine one. So to be able to interview you tonight is humbling, and it's my honor to be able to speak with you tonight. So thank you for this opportunity. My interest in the opportunity is manifold. I mean, I am, first of all, looking to transition back to Massachusetts. To be candid about that aspect of my application, my parents still live in Newburyport. I've been in Illinois for 20 years and never planned to stay this long, but it's time to move my family back home. And so that's why at this time in my career, I'm looking to make that transition. The community of Gloucester is a strong one and a proud one, as I mentioned a moment ago. And I had a chance to look at the school district more closely since I saw the job posting several weeks ago. And as I've looked at what's going on in the district and the kind of progress that's been made, I've been very intrigued by the success of the schools in Gloucester, as well as the challenges that still remain and need to be tackled. I'm hoping that during our conversation this evening, I can identify some areas where I can add some value and hopefully provide some leadership that will help the school district as a whole, as well as individual schools within it, make the progress that they're looking to make. What I learned in the last interview from the amazing group of individuals that were assembled to interview with me, that there is a significant amount of pride and motivation among the faculty, parents, and stakeholders in the community to continue to accelerate excellence at Gloucester Public Schools. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of those ideas. And I hope during the course of tonight's evening, we'll be able to get into that with some detail.
Okay, and if we don't ask you the right questions, you'll have an opportunity at the end of the meeting to fill us in with the things we should have asked you.
I'm sure you'll do great. Thank you.
Okay, Samantha, you have the first question.
Sure, thank you. So Kurt, what are the core values that drive you as an educator, and what core values would you want to see in the staff that you hire?
Absolutely. The first value that comes to mind is collaboration. It's a key component of success in any enterprise of any substance that involves more than one person. And I would say it's particularly important in education. I mentioned before, I used the word stakeholders. And as you all know, as school committee members, you represent many different stakeholders. And even within groups of stakeholders, there's so many types of personalities that you're really dealing with an incredibly dynamic community. And it's so critical that we hear all the different stakeholders within that community, but also find ways of helping them work together. And so collaboration is essential to making sure that we're representing different interests and maximizing opportunities for all students, and using our talents collectively to achieve those outcomes. So the first priority that I present, or that I focus on when I'm entering a new challenge within the education realm, is how do I get the different people who are invested in this particular initiative to work together optimally. And that begins, of course, with looking at the strengths that people bring and finding ways of leveraging those strengths, connecting people with one another in ways that allow for real synergy to occur. It's also really important for us to make sure that people are in the right place to do their best work. So as a school leader, that means making sure that people are assigned to the proper positions and making sure that their day-to-day work and also their annual goals align with what they're capable of contributing. So collaboration is key value. I'm also incredibly committed to open communication within an organization. I think that there's a lot of talk out there about communication being a priority for organizations. And you always hear people talk about communication being essential to a strong relationship, even interpersonal relationships. But I'm not sure that everyone really devotes themselves to improving communication through any kind of substantive means. And I have in fact done that in my career by making it a priority when I was principal of Prospect High School and also as associate superintendent in the district, that we really need to make sure that our communication is very explicit, deliberate, very candid, being willing to talk through those difficult moments with one another, to have those critical conversations. And I think there are structures that we can bring to those kinds of conversations that help people to progress through them to a better place. And it's also important, in addition to the collaboration and the communication aspects, that we bring an empathetic perspective to every one of our interactions. And again, in a school system, it's especially important that we are leading with empathy, that our first approach to any kind of a situation, whether it's a social emotional one to begin with, or if it's a purely academic one, we need to begin with a concerted attempt to understand where the other person is coming from, what their experience involves, what they're feeling, what their concerns are. And if we don't actively engage in empathy up front, we'll have a very difficult time leveraging our strengths and utilizing our resources in the best way possible. So empathy, collaboration, and communication, I'd say, were the three top values that I would bring to a school leadership role in Gloucester or anywhere else.
Okay. Any follow-ups? Okay, the next question would be Mayor Takens, but she is, as I said, driving. So what are the three most important traits you possess as a leader? Can you tell us about a time when you had to make a difficult decision that not everyone agreed with?
Sure. So I would say I bring compassion to every one of my interactions with whether it's students or staff or parents or political leaders, community members. I believe it's especially important for us to recognize as educators that all the individuals that we are serving are deserving of the highest quality experience possible, but they're coming into our schools from very different experiences. In other words, they are coming at us with more or less readiness to embrace our learning objectives. And the only way we understand where an individual is, and that could be the student himself or herself or that student's family, is to engage them with compassion. So that's a trait that's extremely important in any leader, and I believe it's something that I present in my personal life and in my professional life. I also believe clarity is essential as a leader, and it's something that throughout my life I've strived to be very clear in what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to accomplish, what I'm hoping to achieve. I've asked people to join me in that attempt, especially in my professional roles, to be extremely clear and explicit about what it is we're aiming for. One of my favorite quotes, I believe it may be from Nietzsche, but I'm not exactly sure of the source, but I've heard it from different people over the years, is that a person can deal with almost any what as long as he or she has provided a why. So that clarity to explain why we are doing something is critical to helping people understand the purpose they're serving, the challenges they're going to face, and what's required of them to contribute to achieving that goal. So those are two traits that I think are part of my my personality. And also, I would say humor. I think life is a beautiful thing, but it can be difficult, and all of us face challenges, and we need to allow each other to laugh and to allow ourselves to laugh daily and as often as possible, really, so that we can continue to bring joy and happiness, just gladness generally, into the work we're doing. And as school leaders and as teachers and as parents of children in schools, we have to be joyful. We have to embrace the enterprise of education with a tremendous gladness in our hearts, because our children emulate what we demonstrate. And if we're not joyful and we're not happy and we're not laughing and seeing the wonder and the beauty and the splendor and all the amazing things that life presents to us, if we're not embracing that, it's harder for children to see what is worth embracing in the world. And I believe it's absolutely critical at this time, not just because of COVID-19 and the pandemic, which of course present tremendous challenges to us, but I think the state of life in our society, particularly American society, which is an incredible hustle. There's so much pressure to race to the top. There's so much pressure to be somebody of substance. There's so much pressure to acquire material wealth, to compete, that children are finding it sometimes very difficult to feel hopeful and happy, especially when it seems that there aren't as many seats at the table available all the time for everyone. So not only is the challenge of helping students be successful and be prepared to pursue their dreams and to find a position, a career that will satisfy them and reward them and allow them to take care of their families, we also have to help them remember that life is a wonderful thing and should be joyful, because that helps manage stress. It helps minimize anxiety. And we know that children today are dealing with tremendous anxiety, and the mental health challenges that kids face are just overwhelming. And so as adults, we have to lead with that kind of happiness and joy, so that our children see that their future will be a good one and a happy one too.
There was another part to that. Can you tell us about a time when you had to make a difficult decision that not everyone agreed with?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my role for the past 8 years, I've been the person responsible for negotiating contracts. And that means negotiating with the teachers union, negotiating with the support personnel association, negotiating with the custodial maintenance associations. I actually love those experiences. They can be very challenging, of course, because there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot at stake. Taxpayer money, of course, is of critical importance to our community. We have to make sure that we're assigning those resources appropriately and making sure that everyone's being rewarded and affirmed. But at the table, there can be often some difficult conversations that occur, because everyone's priorities are important, and yet sometimes those priorities appear to be competing with one another. And this year in particular, this past year, I'm sorry, we had a real challenge of addressing the need to increase our staffing in special education, because we decided, even going into negotiations, our administrative team decided that we needed to increase the number of staff so that we could decrease the ratio of students to staff in the special ed realm. that was going to require a significant allocation of resources. When you're at the negotiating table, you're obviously trying to empathize with the other side, and you're trying to represent your side, and you're trying to bring those two sides together to one team. And so it's going to be very difficult to achieve a win-win that makes everyone perfectly happy. But I have experienced over this past 8 years that you can absolutely achieve mutual wins that do make everyone at least somewhat happy. And that was an area which I think was quite difficult because of the expenditure at stake in allocating resources to diminish the ratio of students to staff in special ed, put challenges on the backs of our administrators after the contract was negotiated. So we did achieve a change in the ratio. I think it was a good one. I think everyone agrees it serves students well. But even those who agree, even those administrators who agree that it would serve students well, were wondering, well, how are we going to staff the rest of our buildings optimally, given that we have to allocate so many resources in this particular area? And the way we move through that was to continuously discuss the challenge, the options, the scenarios, to find creative solutions and alternatives that would allow us to bring the staffing into that special education space that we promised, but without pulling away from other areas that also deserve to be served at a high level. And it was the dialogue that we continued and we sustained throughout several months of processing the negotiated contract and then processing the implementation of it, that I believe allowed the district to move forward with a staffing plan that did meet everyone's needs and did not result in anyone losing his or her job that we wanted to keep. So that was a very long process of listening, collaborating, empathizing, creative problem solving, and ultimately engaging in shared decision making to make sure that the solution we implemented met the contract, but also met the priorities of the building leaders who had to uphold that contract in those new terms.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Any follow-up on that? Joel is here, has arrived, and
Joel.
just in time, as he has the next question.
My apologies again for being late, and just so it's on the record, I will go back and watch the beginning minutes of this video so that I have everything at my disposal. So this question you can either answer based on the research that you've done into our particular district or simply with your knowledge of the challenges facing most districts in the Commonwealth. And the question is, what do you perceive to be the biggest or most pressing challenge facing our district that you will be able to make swift progress in addressing? And what is the biggest or most pressing challenge that will take the longest to overcome?
It's a great question, and because of the differentiation between a swift solution versus a long-term solution. I've actually never heard a question like that put that way, and I appreciate the complexity of it. If you don't mind, I'd like to tackle the challenge that will probably take a longer time to address and to hopefully resolve, and that involves equity. I believe that we are facing a critical time in our country with respect to the issue of equity. And equity, of course, has many facets. Equity can involve a number of different characteristics and qualities, but I'm specifically concerned about issues of racial equity. I think that we have, at this point in our country's evolution, reached a critical juncture where people are starting to question their commitment to matters of equity, as well as their leaders' commitment to it, and the government and the national focus or national feelings about equity. And it's a bit scary, and it's a bit daunting to consider that some of the advances we seem to have made several years ago during the civil rights era, for instance, are now being almost reprocessed and sometimes reframed and maybe even undone. I think as school leaders, we have absolutely to commit ourselves to an agenda of social justice. I believe school leadership, public school leadership in particular, is commensurate with serving social justice. And so we have to tackle equity as public educators or any stakeholder or school committee member who supports public schooling. That is, of course, going to require a lot of effort over time with a lot of bends in the road, maybe even some setbacks that might seem insurmountable. But I do believe we can make considerable progress. And let me focus on one area where I think this can be achieved and where I think in my role as Associate Superintendent of Human Resources, I've been able to make some progress. And that is with respect to hiring. We have a serious shortage of staff of color in our education ranks right now in this country, yet we have an increasing number of students of color in our schools. And if you think about that phenomenon of an increasing number of students of color and a still low, very low, relatively speaking, number of staff of color, we also have another challenge that results from that disparity, which is how do you recruit the next generation of teachers? How do you recruit the next generation of public school educators when role modeling is so important in identifying students who may aspire to become educators, supporting them, nudging them, and challenging them to pursue the profession? Role modeling is a real phenomenon, and as others have said before me, it's very hard to be what you can't see. So if we have more and more students of color and still very, very few staff of color, how are we going to reach the critical mass of educators to have a representative faculty, not just in Gloucester or in schools in Illinois or throughout the country? How are we going to achieve that unless we take some radical measures to really increase the prestige of the profession and to identify students who would be extremely effective educators and provide opportunities for them to be supported in achieving their credentials so they can serve in the profession? So that is one aspect of the equity challenge that I'm very concerned about. Another challenge I see, and by the way, in Gloucester, the way I see the data reflecting that shows there's economically disadvantaged students in every district in the country. And I noticed that in Gloucester, the economically disadvantaged students, which often do mirror racial demographics, there's a correlation there and correspondence there because of sociological phenomena and economic phenomena in this country. So I do believe we have to try more explicitly, more deliberately to address the challenges that economically disadvantaged students face in Gloucester to see if we can achieve greater equity for those individuals. So that is an area which I think is going to be a long-term challenge for us, but I'm very eager to take that on, and I've done a lot of work in that space in my district by hiring more staff of color, including more administrators and leaders of color, and it makes an impact, and it's going to have, I think, a lasting positive influence on our success and our student success. A more swift solution may be found in the area relative to our work on chronic absenteeism. The data in Gloucester is surprising to me with respect to absenteeism. I noticed that it's a fairly high percentage, at least much higher than I would have anticipated based on what I knew about the community. And I know that it's below the state average. I think the average in Gloucester is around 90% attendance, and I think across the state it's over 94, maybe 94.6. That number sticks in my head. So I'm wondering what we're already doing about absenteeism in Gloucester. And I'm curious to see what progress has been made. I did notice during one of your school board meetings that I watched that I think was a few months ago, it was an excellent opportunity for a candidate like me to learn about each of the schools in the district, because each principal presented data that Dr. Sapphire actually led the school committee through a review of. And I heard some very encouraging news about progress that's being made at all the schools and a few in particular, but I'm still uncertain about what's being done about the absenteeism issue. And so the good news is I think there are ways of really being successful in that space by reaching out to parents in very intentional ways, in very compassionate ways, and encouraging different forms of connectedness with the schools that will allow those students and those families to commit to a more consistent attendance. Now, having said that, this pandemic is going to pose a whole new set of challenges regarding attendance and what that's even going to look like, come September or August or whenever we get back to school. Out in Illinois, we began pretty early in August, and so there are already school districts declaring that they're not going to be opening school in August, that they're going to do virtual learning for the first month or two and see. So there's a lot of different, theories out there about how to proceed, and there's some plans now being put into place. So that's something we're going to have to talk about pretty quickly, is what are we doing with respect to this pandemic, and how are we going to get kids in school, or kids connected to teachers and other staff members and each other in the most meaningful way, given the public health crisis we're facing.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is Kathy.
Okay, this is about budget. What is your view of the role of the superintendent vis-a-vis the district's chief financial officer? How would you develop a good reporting system, monitor the district's finances, and basically how would you build a budget?
So it's absolutely important to have a very strong school finance administrator on board, and I look forward to meeting that individual and working with that person. But the superintendent ultimately has to own the decisions of a budgetary nature, and it's critical that the school superintendent as well as the school committee commit to a balanced budget on behalf of the taxpayers and on behalf of the staff and the students that we're serving. Because of course a balanced budget allows you to stay in the black and prevents you from having to go up for referendum or to have to pursue bonds and to go into debt. So I think a superintendent needs to commit to presenting a balanced budget and living within that budget every year. And so there are difficult decisions that have to be made, and that goes back to the aspect of communication I was talking about earlier, where we have to be candid, transparent, and critical in our conversations, which is to say, be unafraid to have difficult conversations and to make tough decisions, as long as we know that ultimately we're utilizing our resources in the maximum positive way possible, and that we're serving students' needs first and foremost, and making sure staff are protected, safe, and affirmed in their work. In terms of processes for balancing budget, I think every administrator in the district, regardless of his or her role, has to be a steward of the budget. We need to commit collectively to owning our respective budgets and really living as lean as possible, and to be as tight to the line as possible, and to be very forward-looking when it comes to expenditures that may become more exorbitant than we expected. For instance, I did notice in your budget that your athletic budget a couple years ago seemed to almost triple. I mean, unless I'm looking at something wrong, and I'd be curious to know what happened in that particular line item. It could be a very simple explanation, I just don't know. But I did notice that there was a significant increase in the athletic budget allocation, and I'm sure it was for awesome reasons. And I come from an athletic background, and I was a coach as well. And I actually, in my past role, I helped oversee all the directors of athletics and activities in our district. So I'm a huge fan of athletics, but that's an area where I thought, well, there's a big decision made there and something happened. So it could have been the building of a new field or a capital project. I don't have the answer, but in looking at the budget over the past few weeks, I've noticed that it seems pretty consistent across the board, except for that area. I also commend you for seeming to be very prudent in your spending as a district and achieving very strong outcomes with respect to your overall budget. That said, I did notice that your per pupil spending is a couple $1,000s more a year than the state average. And I would, as a superintendent, I'd want to talk quickly with a lot of stakeholders and find out why that is. Is there any way that we could reduce the per pupil spending without hurting students, without in any way shortchanging their experience, or without failing to support staff? Because it's so critical that we are always giving the staff what they need to be outstanding educators. So there are some questions I have. I know this is not the time to get deep into those kinds of inquiries, but as I'm looking across the board, I have a lot of curiosity about some decisions that have been made, knowing that you're in a great place as a district. You're making lots of progress academically in lots of areas. So I know that there's great work going on. And so as the ultimate steward of the budget, I would deputize all my administrators to own it in their respective realms, and we'd have regular meetings to discuss that. I'll finish the answer also by saying that I've been involved in various budget cost containment initiatives over the years, and we've done tremendous work working collaboratively to assess programs, their cost, their impact, and the potential outcome should we make changes in those budgets. We've done a lot of work in that area, working as principals, associate superintendents, division heads. We have really thoroughly explored our budget from end to end and made very tough decisions year after year after year to contain those budgets and basically shorten them or shrink them by about 2% a year over many, many years. I think it's going on now over 10 years that we've contained that budget, even while we found ways of paying for huge capital improvement projects such as new pools. So, and new turf for our fields. So you have to stay apace of the changes in our communities that our schools need to embrace in order to be lovely places to study and to strive and to be able to succeed in the school choice, realm of competition, which, is difficult, but we have to make our schools appealing places, but we also have to do so very prudently.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Melissa has the next question.
Thank you. My question is in regards to school committee relationships.
Mm-hmm.
The role and responsibilities of school committees and superintendents are sometimes clear and sometimes ambiguous. For example, budget approval versus budget implementation, or personnel policy and finance versus personnel administration, or even dealing with a parent and teachers with concerns of complaints. Can you describe some situations where these roles and responsibilities have challenged you and how you would work to address them were you to be as superintendent?
Okay. So I think it's a wonderful question because it does identify that sometimes fuzzy line that demarcates different roles and responsibilities of key decision makers in the district. And in my work, the two senior leadership roles I've held as a school principal of a school that served 2,200 students, so it's a pretty big institution, and as associate superintendent in the district that serves over 12,000 students, I've had opportunities to navigate that line with different senior leaders and different stakeholders as well as school board members. I think it's important for each of us to remember when we come to the table what we are bringing to the table and what perspective it is that we're expected to represent. And sometimes that requires us to speak openly about why we're at the table and what we're there, the reason we're there and what we're there to provide. For instance, going back to negotiations, we always had a school board member on our negotiation team. So I was representing the administration and the board member was representing the board, and the board represents, as you know, everyone in the district as well as those non-tax paying citizens that you have to answer to in the community, right? So there's the board representation is, for lack of a more nuanced word, it's political. The representation that I brought was administrative, and yet I was also the chair of those negotiation teams. So I was very blessed to work with an amazing board and to have incredibly supportive relationships with each of our board members that participated in our negotiation process. And so we never had any real difficulty, but it was important for us occasionally to kind of remember what we were each doing at that table and who we were trying to represent immediately, and then ultimately who we collectively needed to represent as a joint team. And so in those negotiation sessions, we did often have conversations about budget allocation from the administrative perspective versus budget approval from the board's perspective. And those conversations, needed to be very transparent and also needed to keep in mind that there were more people who were influenced by these outcomes of these decisions than were sitting at the table. And so I think one thing that I, as an administrator, and particularly as a superintendent, need to constantly keep in mind is that you all answer to the whole Gloucester community. And you have sidewalk conversations and grocery store conversations, and sometimes you get phone calls at 6 p.m. when you're trying to have dinner about things that people are concerned about, and you need to be able to answer those questions. So it's critical for a superintendent in particular to keep you informed about what's going on, under the superintendent's watch, what's happening that's important for you to know, so you don't get blindsided, so that you're able to answer those questions intelligently and comfortably. And it's also important for there to be reciprocity for the board members to respect the administrative roles and responsibilities on a day-to-day basis that are, the professional space that administrators occupy and navigate. And I think the superintendent needs to be oftentimes kind of a mediator so that those conversations always remain collaborative and always remain mutually supportive. One of the things that I became very fond of saying as a principal of that high school I alluded to that serve 2,200 students and therefore 4,400 parents roughly. Whenever I was speaking to parent groups at that school, I found myself talking about the one hand washes the other kind of approach to education and actually organizational leadership and organizational culture. And I came up with a phrase that I find myself using time and time again, which is that we together can create a virtuous cycle. That if we give each other the information we need, respect each other's roles, honor boundaries, but have the trust and faith in each other to speak across those boundaries, we can achieve great things. So for example, parents might come and complain about a coach that they don't think the coach is playing the right players, or the coach is being too harsh with the kids, or the coach's approach is old school and it's not empathetic enough to the children on the team. And those parents have absolutely every right to voice those concerns, and they have every right to bring those concerns wherever they want. They can bring them to the principal, they can bring them to the athletic director, or to the coach himself or herself. But it's also important for the administrator to say, thank you for that feedback. Now we are going to put this into a professional process of evaluation and review and determine if a needs assessment has to occur, if changes have to be made within the program, or if changes have to be made in the staffing of the program. So there needs to be enough trust to hand that difficult, critical work over to the administration to manage it fairly and as transparently as possible, but ultimately to own it. And I think when you have that virtuous relationship with your parent community, they will ultimately trust you to do what's right for kids, because ultimately parents want what's right for their kid, and they should. We want what's right for all kids, as we should. And we need to make sure we're constantly talking to each other and providing that why, so that when we have to make those difficult decisions and implement maybe a hard action that may result in a reassignment, say, we should be comfortable enough to say we did the right thing for the right reasons and we know it. And now we can proceed and again in that virtuous cycle move to another level of accomplishment and success together.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, Laura, you have the next question.
Yes, thank you. So my question is about communications and community relationship building. How have you built lines of communication and reached out to build community constituencies and strengthen relationships with local stakeholders and families? And then part two, please give an example of a situation in which these relationships were important in achieving a positive outcome.
Great. So communication, as I mentioned earlier, is a core concern, core priority of mine. And I actually made a communication model a central piece of my leadership strategy while at Prospect High School. It's the end of my first year. I was participating in a staff development meeting, which is to say I was one member of many colleagues around a table. I was not leading the meeting. The staff development chair was leading the meeting. And after several minutes of conversation about some other topics, he turned to me and said, okay, Kurt, you've been in this job as principal for 1 year. What do you think we should be working on as a staff? And I said, thanks for the opportunity to give my input. We need to work on communication. We have a very outstanding school. We have tremendous results. We have a great reputation, but our communication is sometimes poor. It's definitely spotty and inconsistent. And I'm talking about the way we talk to each other, the way we talk up and down the chain of command, the way we talk to parents and students sometimes. There's not a consistent style or tone to those conversations, and we need to do a better job of presenting ourselves as prospect knights who care about kids first, but also include all stakeholders in our conversations in a very thoughtful, deliberate way. And so I actually laid out a protocol. I called it RER, and it stands for reflective, empathetic, and responsive communication. And the order is significant. It's important because in my approach to this and my strategy to communication, you really can't get to a response until you've reflected deeply and then empathized mutually, reciprocally, and only when the empathy has sort of landed and been recognized and affirmed, only then can you move to a response that will address whatever challenge or concern exists. So that RER model I used as principal, set an example for the school. I was very heartened when I would hear people come to me and say, "Hey, Kurt, I talked to that parent that we were having some difficulty with, and I RER'd the conversation and it went really well." Or, "Hey, we had that department meeting the other day, and we just kept on hitting that that impasse about curriculum change, but I RER'd it and really listened to what the teachers were saying, and after I did, they agreed to make the change." So it really worked, and it gave people a very simple model to follow. And also gave me a way of asking them, when a staff member would come to me and say, "I'm having difficulty here. How can I ask them, have you reflected openly and transparently with this individual?" "Oh yeah, I got to do that." "Yeah." Or have you empathized? And have you empathized to the point that the person said, "Now you hear me. Now you get where I'm coming from. Okay, what are we going to do about it?" Because you got to get to that point if this is going to be a sustainable improvement and a sustainable solution. Now, I used that model in all my interactions throughout the past 15 years, because I think it was around 15 years ago that I came up with that. And I've used it at home to greater or lesser success. I've used it certainly in talking to parents. And one thing that we're able to accomplish as a school is to improve our parent relations by having open forums with our parents, call them coffees with the principal. We have regular attendance at those. We also did a good job of sending out newsletters, which were very comprehensive and very emotionally honest, rather than sort of just listing what was going on at the school and celebrating who did this and who did that, which is important. I tried very hard in those newsletters to talk about the tenor in the building and the tone of our dynamic together, the sort of the status of the culture, or what's going on out there that's affecting what's happening in here, and really tried to be very deliberate. I like writing. I've written articles. I've pushed articles out in the newspaper a few times and other places like Education Week. I've tried to be a voice for education because I care about public education very much. But I think that kind of communication has to occur first in the building that you're leading or in the district that you're leading. And so one real outcome that we achieved as a school, by the way, I'll go back to that Prospect High School scenario. I held staff forums with our faculty on a regular basis, which is to say they weren't just faculty meetings, they were open forums, and anyone could speak about anything they wanted to talk about. And I would stand there and sort of be the clearinghouse so the ideas would come to me, and then I would push them back to the faculty after. So I would hear and receive what was being shared by those who were willing to speak at those forums, and that number grew and grew and grew over time. And then if I could address the question standing there in front of the faculty, I would. If I needed more time to process or to include other stakeholders in the conversation, I would do that and come back to it later. So we had a very iterative process of open conversation channeled through the leadership of the building, and then going back out to the stakeholders after we had a chance to mull it over, or to form a committee, or to do a needs assessment or a survey. So there was a constant looping process that began with that open forum, and that produced tremendous improvements in our unity as a school culture.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Next question is mine. And not being from Massachusetts, or not working in Massachusetts, some of this, I'd be happy to explain any of this. It's about buildings and such. So the question is, Gloucester is about to submit the schematic design to the Massachusetts School Building Authority for a new elementary school, which will house a consolidation of two smaller elementary schools. If approved, by the MSBA, Gloucester will have to secure our part of the funding with a debt exclusion override vote in November. Are you in favor of consolidation? And if so, how would you make that case to the public? Now, MSBA is the state's funding source for building new schools, and they pay different communities different percentages of the cost of the school depending on the demographics of the city. Schematic design is the point where you've come up to, you have a plan, you have a location, and you're ready to start doing functional working plans to put the job out for bid. MSBA requires that before you go forward from this point, that the funding is in place. So a debt exclusion override is basically because of Proposition 2.5, which is our tax,
Right.
property tax limit cap, is basically a mechanism to increase the property taxes for the purpose of paying off a debt.
Mhm.
So it goes away after the debt's paid
Right,
off. So,
right.
but the issue in Gloucester is that we're consolidating schools, and we're taking two schools that are both around 210, 220 students, and we're going to be creating a school that's 440, and that has a certain amount of controversy.
Right. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for giving me the easy question there, Mr. Pope. No, that I've been following that a bit in the research I've done on the school district. And so, am I right in saying that you've decided on the Matos Field Veterans Memorial Site?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so, your question, if I heard you correctly, is am I in favor of the consolidation? And are you asking, am I in favor of the debt exclusion override?
Well, no, I'm just saying that the consolidation will be a question
I see.
that people will be talking about during the override vote. You can't take you're just supposed to be providing information. So the question is to the public. You're not supposed to be advocating for a political things. That's so. But the question is, how would you explain why or why not consolidation might be a good idea?
I see. Great. Well, thanks for clarifying that. So in following that story, I actually thought, sitting here in my office, looking at information on the internet, wow, that's a hard one. Because, people love the schools that they attended, that their children attend. They have great affinity for those schools. There's loyalty, which is a wonderful thing to an institution. There is a sense of familiarity. There's even a sense of home. And to just say, sorry, your school is going to close and your kid's going to go somewhere else, even if it's a closer commute, even if it's a brand spanking new building with all kinds of cool accoutrement and all kinds of wonderful technology and aesthetic, details and effects, it's still very, very difficult to leave your home. And so there's a real social and an emotional challenge there for those individuals who will be, for lack of a better word, displaced and moved. So I mentioned before the word empathy several times. We have to engage all those conversations from the perspective of thinking about what it must feel like for those parents and those children who are going to go someplace that they didn't know they were going to go, they didn't intend to go, and they maybe don't want to go. And what we have to do is feel what they're feeling and articulate that feeling with them as often as possible until they're ready to say, okay, so what's this new school all about? What's this new school going to involve? I wish I had a magic bullet answer for you, Mr. Pope, and for everyone else in the committee, but the reality is, conversation by conversation, we have to be thoughtful and sensitive, because this is a real, serious, impactful, emotional experience for people. I know in our district, before I came to Illinois, I came out 20 years ago, but in our district, several years before that, they closed down a high school. Actually, they closed down two high schools and then moved the students to other buildings that were newer and I guess improved. To this day, people still feel that. They still feel affected by that. They still talk about it. But because there's a lot of effort made to honor the school, to memorialize the school, to recognize graduates of the school, to invite people to celebrate as alumni of the school in different ways whenever there was a district experience, where they could participate, people were allowed to kind of keep their feeling alive, and they were allowed to keep their pride intact, and to be participants of celebrations as representatives of that school that no longer existed. And there was just it requires a lot of mindfulness to keep that focus and that feeling present when the school itself closes down and students move elsewhere. But there needs to be a real deliberate effort on the part of the school leaders and the school board to recognize the significance of this change. And I gleaned from the school board meeting I watched, as well as the articles I've read, that you're trying very hard to be thoughtful and sensitive. And I actually wanted to commend you on how you've handled those conversations. I know that I can imagine that tensions run high, and that sometimes you just want to get forward and make the decision and let's get this bulldozer out there and start plowing the field and, you know, and pouring the concrete. But you've been very patient from what I could tell, and I respect that. As a new leader in the district where that change has already been authorized, it would fall on me to be a lead spokesperson on behalf of the district making the change, but also the individuals affected by it. So it's like straddling both worlds, but also leading with empathy. I hope that answers your question.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It does fine. Kathy, you have the next question.
Okay, next question has to do with professional development. Across the different levels of the district, describe how you will know whether professional development programs and initiatives have affected the knowledge, skills, and practices of educators in the district.
That's a great question too. So I'm understanding it to ask, how do you assess if there's been an impact of the professional development that you authorize and fund? And right, that's a good question. I've quite honestly never heard it put that way before, because we talk a lot about what professional development we need and why we need it, but I don't think we talk often enough about how do we know it actually made a difference. So great question. Well, I think you have to, if we're going to, if you identify a particular professional development goal and then a program or initiative that's going to address that goal, we have to start collecting data on student performance and staff performance relative to that goal, and then track the impact over time, and then look at the data at different stages in the implementation. So there needs to be a data-driven model of assessment where you're looking at, starting points, midpoints, and then of course endpoints. And just the same way we track student progress, when we're using a particular learning method in a classroom, I hope you have professional learning committees or communities in your school. I know we rely on them profoundly in our district, and teachers own them. They do require a lot of work and collaboration, but we've been very excited to see that staff want more time to work with each other. And the primary reason you have professional learning communities is not just the design of the curriculum in the learning processes, in the instructional methodologies, but in the formative assessment of the student progress. So tracking how students are doing, regrouping, remodeling perhaps, and then moving forward, assessing, and then backward tracking again to see where it got off the rails or where it may be succeeding. That process is very familiar to educators working in professional learning communities. And it seems arduous, but it's like the work of the day. It's what you need to do. If we're going to implement professional development models, we need to be coming at that with a data-driven mindset. So we're not just throwing money at something and saying, "There you go. Let's see if this works. I hope something sticks." It can't be that arbitrary. One of the models that we followed in our district that I'm very I'm proud of, because I was part of it, but I don't want to own responsibility for the creative genius behind it, but I was part of the process of assessing teacher-led initiatives relative to the use of technology, particularly one-to-one computing. And so we had a very innovative approach to implementing the one-to-one computing, rather than just giving laptops or giving iBooks or giving iPads or Chromebooks, whatever, to kids and saying, "I hope this makes a difference, and I hope you guys find that this helps your teaching." We did a very deliberate implementation that was phased in through piloting, which is to say we had teachers present proposals saying, "I want to pilot the use of the iPad for these specific reasons, and I'm going to track them, and I'm going to track the use of them and the impact that's having on students' learning, and report back to you on a quarterly basis. And then at the end of the year, we're going to assess if that pilot had an impact that was worth replicating and scaling up. And if so, we'd scale it up. And if it didn't, we'd say, "Hey, great try. Thank you so much for being courageous enough to put your idea out there, but we're not necessarily going to go forward with that particular initiative, but we congratulate you on failing forward." That's a term we use quite a bit, failing forward, because that's the only way you innovate, is to allow people permission to fail as long as they're trying in earnest. And so I think we have to do something similar with respect to our professional development. And again, I love the question, because I don't think anyone's ever asked, how do you make sure that the development is actually developing?
Samantha, you have the next question.
Thank you. So I think my question is a commitment to equity in your work, and I do feel like you've spoken to that already. So in the interest of time, I am going to let somebody else move forward, and then at the end, I'll have an additional question if that's okay.
Great. Fine, thank you, Samantha.
Okay, Joel, you're up.
Thank you. And obviously recognizing that you are not currently working in the Commonwealth, this question refers to the MCAS, which is the statewide standardized testing that we use in several grades for various assessments.
Yep.
And so you can kind of broaden this question out to the concept of standardized testing that your district may employ where you are. And my question is, what are your thoughts on these type of one-size-fits-all standardized testing as an evaluation tool for students, as an evaluation tool for teachers, and an evaluation tool for districts? We'll notice that my connection was unstable. Did that question come through?
I think I heard every word. Thank you, Joel.
Okay.
And I appreciate the question. We are professionals in education. I think we fought long and hard to be considered true professionals, and we need to prove it by being accountable. There are different ways of demonstrating accountability, and I think standardized testing is one way. It's not the only way, and it shouldn't be the only way, but it's one way. I think it's really important for us to understand what the tests are actually testing before we start weighing in on whether it's a good test or bad test. So there needs to be a thorough assessment of the tests that are being used, and to understand whether or not they're addressing skills that we find are valuable and important for students to learn, even if there were no standardized tests in the world. What we found in Illinois, and I think it's similar, I've worked in Massachusetts, I was an educator in Massachusetts before moving out here, and the MCAS is familiar. I'm familiar with it, and I'm familiar with a lot of the school improvement work that was done prior to its implementation that was related to accountability. And so I think we're talking about the same basic animal here. And in Illinois, we've used the ACT. Actually, you may not be familiar, but there's a battery of tests that relate to the ACT. Explore, for instance, is a test that freshmen take. And then there's a test called Plan, and then the ACT. We've since shifted to the SAT in the last couple of years, and so there's a similar battery of standardized tests that we use statewide. And we made sure that if we were going to be held accountable, which, by the way, we had to be accountable because the state implemented this, just like the MCAS is something you have to be accountable for. We immediately, this is going back many years, immediately began diagnosing the test from top to toe. I was part of that in a very big way when I was a division head of English and Fine Arts, because English, of course, and reading are two huge skills areas that are assessed on these standardized tests. So I spent countless hours digging into specific questions to understand what exactly these questions are trying to get at, what skills were related to the questions, what skills were consistently showing up as important areas of focus, which ones, which questions were the most difficult for our students to answer and why. So we did tremendous diagnostic analysis on the test instrument itself. And I am somewhat happy to report that, and I think this is true of the SAT and others, that most of these tests are well enough designed that they do get at critical skills that are 21st century relevant. For instance, reading comprehension, writing from sources. In some cases, you're talking about referring to a nonfiction passage and finding a proper answer or response. Math skills, of course, across the board are of critical importance to our students, no matter what their field of study will be after high school or what their career pathway will be. So as one form of accountability, I think it's important, and since it's imposed on the state, we have to own it. But we have to make sure, and I think this is absolutely important and essential to our mission as public educators, we have to make sure that our students are viewed as whole beings who demonstrate excellence, who demonstrate readiness, who demonstrate talent in myriad ways. That there's absolutely no way that any test, no matter how well designed, is going to accurately reflect the multifaceted complexity of an individual child. and therefore is not going to be able to represent or reflect what that child is capable of doing with his or her life. We have a motto in our districts. It's discover your future. Kids are actively seeking knowledge and information and experiences to inform who they are as individuals and therefore what they want to be as adults. And if we use just a test to shine back on them one particular angle of a perspective on who they are, we're not helping them at all in that process of identifying and charting their future. So we have to be very, very mindful that readiness is measured in multiple ways. And we actually embraced and advanced an extremely ambitious effort to define readiness for life after high school. We call it the Redefining Ready movement. And it's actually gained national traction because it is getting at exactly what I believe your question is angling at, which is that we need to assess readiness within the children that we serve in multiple ways if we're truly going to serve their interests and help them realize their respective personal ambitions.
Thank you. Melissa, you have the next question.
Thank you. My question is about collective bargaining.
Mm-hmm.
And your resume has extensive experience, and you've also talked about it a lot. So I was almost going to refer this question for the sake of time, but I'm curious. Let me ask the question and then tell you how I'd like you to answer.
Sure.
What is the best role of a superintendent in collective bargaining, in your opinion? What are your experiences at the bargaining table? And how would you propose that we use the bargaining process to promote student achievement as well as control our expenses? So I think you've touched on that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'd like to dig into a little bit deeper is you mentioned in Illinois that you are the lead negotiator and that there's one member in the negotiating team from the school committee.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I want to dig a little deeper to find out, would that be your preference to do it here, or do you have experiences doing collective bargaining in another way that might be your preference as opposed to the way you do it in Illinois?
So I've only done collective bargaining in this district, and that's how we've done it. But I know it's done differently in different districts all around us. I know our superintendent was very interested in the bargaining process and also was very involved in providing input along the way. And certainly, had the responsibility of having to own the contract we negotiated. So I respected the challenge that posed for our superintendent, and also respected that he allowed me to run the process. And I can imagine there were times it was frustrating because I'm sure he wanted to be part of that immediate conversation, but he refrained because that's how it was done before him, and he honored the board's expectation. So I think ultimately it came down to what does the board want? So what do you want in terms of your participation and involvement in that process? And what is it currently? And maybe before I answer your question, perhaps I could hear a little bit about what do you currently do and how important it is for you to preserve that current strategy.
Sure. So we have about 7 different groups that we negotiate with in the school. Majority of them are collective bargaining, some are non-union members. In the 2 bigger groups, being the teachers and the paraprofessionals, we have a labor attorney come in the room. The school committee divides up the number of groups and has negotiating teams for each group. There's 2 or 3 members on each of the 6 or 7 groups that we have. So when we go into negotiations, it's usually 3 school committee members. The 2 larger groups, we have the labor attorney and the superintendent comes in with us, and the business officer, the office man, the budget person. So that's how we do it now. I've been on this committee for 12, 13 years, and that's how it's always been done pretty much. But I'm just curious to know what your opinion is on maybe on that process, or like I said, the experiences that you've had where maybe not so many school committee members were involved?
So I think a lot depends on the size of the district, and that's one thing that I think mitigated in favor of us having a different approach, because we We are, first of all, a high school district, so we don't have elementary schools in our district. It's 9 through 12. And so that's also important to consider too. We didn't have as many stakeholders with respect to levels of education to represent at the table. And again, there was a history and a tradition of having one board member and then the associate superintendent and then a team of other administrators on that side of the table. I'm open to anything, to be honest with you, as long as everyone at that table is committed to being truly collaborative and not approaching the negotiations from a positional bargaining perspective. So this is, I guess I can answer your question by talking a little bit about personal negotiating philosophy. I definitely believe in a collaborative process. I've used interest-based bargaining in the past formally, meaning we follow the full structure in one of our negotiations. I don't feel that's necessary to follow formally every time. If people on both sides of the table are in a good place and have general trust for each other and are ready to merge, if there's tension and there's a lot of this going on prior to negotiation, then you may need to approach that session, although those sessions through an interest-based bargaining model where you are requiring everyone to listen to each other's stories. You know, kind of going back to my comment before about communication structures and protocols are important. So depending on the status of the relationship and the dynamic that exists going into the sessions, we may or may not want to have an interest-based bargaining model. But I absolutely believe the principles of interest-based bargaining must apply because everyone deserves to feel heard and everyone deserves a win. And I think a question that was embedded in your overall question, as I heard it before, is how do you keep students in mind, or how do you ensure that students are being served? Or I think you asked along the lines of how does the negotiation impact students? If we're not constantly reminding each other that the reason we're at this table is to make sure we're giving students the absolute best that we can provide them, then we need to stop, regroup, reframe, and remind each other that's why we're here. This is not an ego contest, and it's not a personality, conflict. This is about how we as professionals from different vantage points are going to come together to make sure that Gloucester's resources are being used for Gloucester's kids to be ultimately successful in the pursuit of their passions and dreams. And also, staff need to make sure that they are getting the support they need to do incredible work. And so if we're missing the point, we need to regroup. I would probably want to be at the table, to be honest with you, but I'm not sure I'd want to lead the sessions necessarily, depending on, I'd have to do an assessment of the personnel that we're working with and who's at the table, but I might want to be a participant in the conversation so that I can try to represent as many vantage points as possible. I think a superintendent should be very broad-minded. And even though the superintendent answers to the board and the administration are always allied on one side of the table in negotiations, I think board members and the superintendent have to remember at the end of the day, and when all this is said and done and all the ink is dried on the deal, you represent everyone in the organization and everyone the organization affects, including non-child rearing taxpayers in the community. We have to think very broadly. So perhaps it would be advantageous for me to be at the table, but not chairing the negotiation process and trying to see where we can straddle and come together.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Laura, you have the final question.
There we go. Am I unmuted?
I hear you now.
Sorry about that. This is about teaching and learning. We know that all kids can learn, but not all do learn. To what extent is their ability to learn and our ability to serve them a function of curriculum and good classroom instruction and/or a function of good finances and/or emotional support? And what can you as superintendent do to improve the outcomes students have? And the second part is, how have you done this elsewhere?
So as a superintendent, clarity in leadership, clarity in goal setting, and clarity in terms of mission identification, and then providing feedback to the organization and to the individuals within it about how well we are progressing toward the achievement of that mission are critical to student success ultimately. And there's a lot of research that shows that strong superintendent leadership does have an impact on student learning. And it basically comes down to the factors that I just enumerated, just, like clarity, communication, vision, also establishing non-negotiable goals, but providing feedback and support, and making sure, as I said way at the beginning of the interview, making sure people are in the right place where they can do their best work, making sure that we're identifying what people's talents are, positioning them appropriately so they can be successful. So that's critical. I think from the curriculum design perspective, it's so important that our curriculum is highly relevant to students' lives and the futures that they're contemplating, and also very rigorous. So relevance and rigor are extremely important to making sure that students are being well served. It also helps to, if we have a very relevant and rigorous curriculum, it helps us to make sure that students are being served equally and therefore equitably in every classroom under every teacher that they encounter. One of the great aspects of education is that teachers are amazing and teachers make a huge difference in the lives of their children. One of the scary things about education is that a student can have a teacher who's phoning it in, and then his neighbor, his sibling, could have a teacher who's coming full bore every day and bringing his A game or bringing her A game. That is something that we as administrators, as superintendent, associate superintendent, principals, we have to make sure that every teacher is given what they need to be successful, and that we're helping them and championing them and cheering them to bring their A game every day. It starts with a very tight curriculum that is aligned to skills, and that kids are being assessed relative to their progress, relative to those skills. That alignment is so essential. We've done in our district over the past 15, 16 years, and as a division head of English Fine Arts, I was sort of instrumental in the early stages of this implementation of this realignment of our curriculum to skills, so that all of our core courses have skills spines where you can identify at any point in the curriculum what skills are being taught, what level of skill mastery is required of kids, and then within the formative assessment processes that those courses have built in, we can determine which kids are actually hitting those skills or mastering those skills and which need more help and intervention. That's a very, very intensive and very complicated process. But if you can commit as a school faculty, and each of your schools at every level needs to commit to this, to making sure that your curriculum is not content driven, but skills focused, and that content can be layered around the skills to make it appealing and entertaining and also relevant, that we can give them the skills that they need to progress to the next level and to be prepared for their future beyond high school. Now, I will say also, I don't know the extent to your career pathways development in Gloucester, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. But as I said earlier, we need to make sure that kids, that their curriculum is relevant to their plans beyond high school. One of the critical mission shifts that we underwent as a district over the past decade is going from being concerned about how kids do when they're with us, which is to say the grades they get or the scores they attain on tests, to being concerned about how they succeed after they've left us. So you think about that for a second, that's sort of a fundamental pivot. We went from concern about what they do when they're with us and then shaking their hand on graduation day and saying, have a great life, to saying, no, we want to track them in college and in career pathways beyond high school to find out, did they get the job they want? Are they succeeding in college? Are they staying on after the first semester, or did they drop out? Did they go to a 2-year school? If they went to a 2-year school, did they progress to a 4-year school? We need it to, because it's a backward design. Until we know how kids are doing in the world beyond high school, how do we know that we succeeded in the high school education? Similarly, in high school, we have to track their performance back to how they did in middle school and then back to elementary school. There's this backward design process that we need to embrace. It's not easy, but it can be really fun when you see the success that results from that kind of analysis and that kind of diagnosis of student experience. And also, this reminds me of something that Thomas Guskey said at a conference years ago. Thomas Guskey is very famous for value-added models of assessment, growth models of assessment. And he talks about the process of real change does not begin with buy-in, which leads to change, which leads to outcomes. That's what we kind of want to think, like, let's get everyone bought in and then we can make a change. It doesn't work that way. And that change never really happens. You have to actually embrace ideas that are research supported, data supported, and then have the courage to make a change, to commit to something. And I can tell you, a skills-based curriculum is critical to creating relevant, rigorous curriculum for kids. So you make that change, and then people start seeing the results And then they buy in and say, I want more of this. And that's where our professional learning communities became so essential to our undertaking and have become areas where teachers want more time, because they know that the good work occurs when they're collaborating with their colleagues, talking about what worked, what didn't work, how you did it, how I did it, how she did it, how he did it, and figuring out we can make this better across the board by sharing best practice and effective approaches among each other. So rigorous and relevant curriculum related to aspirations that go beyond high school are essential to a strong curriculum that serves every kid equitably.
Okay, thank you. We've got a few minutes, Samantha, if you'd like to, Laura, you wanted to follow up on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that in the sense that one of the options or one of the issues in here was emotional support and where that is. And I just, if you could just briefly speak to that. I want Samantha to have time, but you know, where does emotional support fit into this model?
Everywhere. It fits in everywhere. As a building leader, as a division head, and as a classroom teacher and a coach years ago, and then as a building principal, I was primarily focused on social and emotional well-being, both among staff and among students. And by the way, by extension, parents and families too. We really have to think in loco parentis, you know, which is to say, you know, that when the kids are in our schools, they're our kids. We are in many ways acting as their parents in place of the parents that they're returning to at the end of the day. We have to love kids that way. And we have to be caring and concerned all the time about how they're feeling and what they're experiencing. And so you achieve that in different ways. One way is by making sure that every single interaction you have, every micro interaction you have with a staff member, or student, or parent, you've got to bring your authentic personality and your compassion and kindness into that interaction before anything else gets talked about. We need to demonstrate that you're concerned about it. We as leaders need to demonstrate that we're concerned about people as people first, checking in with them regularly, and just day to day, through the hallway, in your office, at the game on Friday night, at the choir concert, wherever you are. You've got to lead with that kind of love, and that's something that I have done throughout my career. In fact, whenever I give coaching sessions to leaders and administrators, I actually conclude with a slide that says, lead with love and the rest will follow. Lead with love and the rest will follow, because that has to be our calling card. We're dealing with a very complicated endeavor, which is helping to edify individuals so they can go out in the world and do great things and really correct some of the mistakes that we've made. And we need to make sure, as I said at the beginning, that they're glad and happy to in that edifying process, that they're being supported and cared about and cheered all along the way. So social emotional support is absolutely important. And by the way, there are structural things that we can do, such as forming early intervention teams to make sure that we're always addressing kids as whole individuals, providing interventions of different natures to make sure they're being supported, making referrals along the way. I implemented a mentoring program, a peer mentoring program when I was at Prospect, called Leading Incoming Nights, where we paired freshmen with upper class peers. And so they always had an older kid to connect with to help them navigate the school. And we had a character education model that students led that was just amazing, that was led by faculty members and students, but the students did the actual teaching in the classrooms. So peers were learning from peers about issues that were critically important. For instance, they might talk about bullying. They might talk about, social media, and they would teach each other about what was important. And so that's a form of social and emotional caring that is structured, but nonetheless has an impact that is felt within the individual child.
Thank you.
Okay. Samantha, did you have a follow-up question you'd like to ask?
No, thank you. I'm all set.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
All right. Well, that concludes the question part of the this evening. And now, if you'd like to just wrap up your thoughts and, like I say, answer some questions we didn't ask, that would be great. Thank
Well,
you.
I'll be relatively succinct because I know I've had a chance to expound on a lot of different questions, and they were great questions. I truly mean that. You challenged me, and it shows how much you care about the school district and how much you want to select a good leader for Gloucester at this time. So I do want to say, in response to a question that Samantha was about to ask, that in building on the issue of equity, I've been very concerned about equity in my professional work and in my personal life too. I actually formed a committee called the Racial Equity and Education Committee in our district, which is very representative of all races in our district. It's populated by staff at this point, and we've all been trained in Beyond Diversity, Courageous Conversations, which is a tremendously rigorous protocol for having conversations about race and being mindful of our own perspective on race, and also making it possible for us to tackle, challenges that often get swept under the rug, and being more cognizant of other people's experience that is driven or at least influenced by their respective race. And so racial equity has been a big focus of mine, but equity generally, as I mentioned earlier, has to be a key priority for public educators because, as I said, public education is commensurate with social justice leadership. We have to be concerned about that. So I wanted to just address that in my closing statement. And then finally just say, my leadership style is one that really works to identify strengths in individuals and to leverage those strengths and to leverage the good in people as well. Each of us is good. We all make mistakes. We all have shortcomings, but each of us has something very valuable to offer. And we need, as leaders, to identify the good and the talent and the passion in people, and we need to exploit it. We need to bring it out in the open and put them in places where they can be successful and cheer and celebrate and champion every chance we get. I'm very, very committed to positive leadership, to joyful leadership, and to making sure that our organization is a happy one. I'm also very committed to a culture that learns together, grows together, and laughs together. Culture holds it all together, and I believe the superintendent is the key cultural leader in the district, and I would love for the opportunity to be that cultural champion, to be a champion of collaboration and compassion over competition. Collaboration and compassion over competition is probably a mantra that I remind myself of every day I go into work, because it's not about me and it's not about winning. It's about helping other people be their best selves and making sure that we're providing the resources and opportunities so that they can grow and they can explore their interests and they can be happy individuals. So thank you for this opportunity. It's been really my honor speaking with you. I appreciate very much your time.
Thank you very much. And we will, like I said, we have one more interview and then we'll try to narrow the field. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very
very
much. And
much.
good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
okay,
Bye.
thanks. Okay.
What's tomorrow at 4, is it?
4 o'clock tomorrow. We have one more, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards of where we stand on the candidates. You got to get a picture with some sun in it. You have snow on top of City Hall.
I know.
Let's get some. Let's get the sun out here. Come on.
You're lucky you got that. Don't even grind
Get
it.
the chills
Without
just
James-
looking at it.
Without James, I'm lost. Don't even go there. Don't even go there. Don't even go there. So it's
Okay.
your fault. You raised a beautiful son.
Uh.
Sons, I should say, but James is my favorite. Everyone be safe, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thanks, Melissa, for reminding me, because 5 to 6 Zooms, I've already missed 2 today after doing 10, but an interview here and at that, and then I ran when you guys were on the Channel 5 because they could hear you Zooming when I was doing my little Pavilion Beach little video on Channel 5. So, but it's kind of difficult. We all have a nice weekend, and like I said, you guys are planning for tomorrow, and I have to look for September because it's going to be scary. Just don't know what's going to come down the pipeline. I know people might think that, oh, no, you know what? We don't know. And so today I had Kenny Coster actually contact Gary for me so we can work together, because if we can get some grants in, there's like 2.6 million. If we can go after that, it'd be kind of nice. And so we can see what we can get back, so we can have a little bit of plus, and we can get our PPEs and everything we might need and extra stuff for September. So I'm hoping. They said, well, Mayor, if you don't spend the money, you have to return it. Don't worry, we can spend the money. That's one thing we can do, is we can spend money. So, but like I said, Dr. Sapphire was also with us when we were talking about it last Friday. And I says, we have to think about the schools. You know what? We have to work together because in order for you and I, so in case some of the principals out there, I don't know who's out there, and look at the panelists, but I sent an email out to, I talked to James Cook. He was telling me about graduation and what's happening about the graduation on the 20th, the movie, the video. And I asked him if he could talk to the principals to find out if each principal can think of, what they could do in their schools that they might have to do to prepare it for September, or extra work, or how they're going to social distance and everything else, what they might need. And think, and I say to them, and it's kind of hard, it's scary, people. I says, you have to think of this. I says, like I said to the Senator Warren and everyone else, and I say it all the time, you have to think of these children who really, for 8 hours of the day, were just with their teachers, basically. And who could be still at home with violence or seeing the trauma or and I want to continue what they're seeing. But these children are going to go back to school, and they're could be like a year behind, or just a year behind. I meaning just to open up again to the teachers, or just to actually be, let's see, ahead of the game, because we don't know if their parents or what's happening or what they're really understanding and not understanding. So I says, you know what, they're going to need help. We might have to add more paraprofessionals. We might have to get more, social workers, therapists, whatever, backup, whatever. We have to think of that. I don't want to think always negative, but we have to think of that, because if this happens in September, the teachers that I talk to and stuff would say, it's so hard, because my heart's breaking is because I don't see my student, and I know sometimes they're hungry, or sometimes you can tell there's been trauma in their life. Okay. And I see that, and work with that, but not to see it now since March, except on Chrome, and sometimes you don't see anything if you don't want to, and then not seeing them all summer long, and then come back in September and no one's dealing with these issues. There's going to be some difficulties, and we're going to have to be ready. And I want to make sure that we start off good, that we can say, I don't want them to say, well, if the mayor wants to put it in our budget, or if the mayor needs to do this and we don't have it. I want to say, no, guess what? Well, we got part of that $2.6 million. Let's use it. Let's do it. So we're working on that. So I just want to let you know. Then I have another good news for you. On June 14th, on graduation day, I know that you guys wanted to do your movies and do that on graduation nights. You know how we did with the Cape Air Museum is proudly co-sponsoring on their beautiful White Mini House. We're going to do something for the graduates, and I'm sure James will let you all know. And we want to do the same exact thing like we did for the frontliners, make noise, go around the Rotary, go back to O'Malley School, and, because that's the day they were supposed to graduate. And I know that you couldn't do your video, but doesn't mean we have to be quiet either. So I think on that night, we're going to raise hell in the city of Gloucester the night of graduation. So I'm good for that, right, Joel?
Okay, thank you.
All right. Have a good day, babe.
Jonathan, does the mayor need to be in part of the roll call vote to adjourn the meeting?
Yeah, she's here. Do we?
Okay.
Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, Maria, roll call vote.
Joel,
Yes.
Jonathan,
Yes.
Melissa,
Yes.
Safathia,
Yes.
Samantha,
Yes.
Laura,
Yes.
and Kathy.
Yes.
Okay. The meeting is adjourned, and we'll see you all tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much, and stay safe.